Alright, we are live on the dot. Let me get the door closed. You would need water bottles because I know I needed it the last time.
Thank you.
And then I think I mentioned it last time, but I live stream the class at the same time. So I got people online who are watching. They can chat and ask questions. First and foremost, hello everybody. Welcome back to another camera class. Today is the second Thursday of the month. So today we are doing the intermediate camera knowledge. For everybody in person with me today, by all means, as I'm talking, interrupt at any point in time, ask a question. Anybody online who's watching, and let me just make sure I have it pulled up properly. I do. I'm in the bottom corner. Perfect. Anybody online watching, you can just chat and ask a question right away. I gotta change this one day. I kept the graduating from point and shoot on there. Really, the idea next for intermediate cameras is we're graduating from using the automatic setting or the P program setting for automatic and moving into more manual control. We've gotten maybe a better feel for what the limitations of automatic are. Maybe we have notes on what we want to improve on in our photography. And this class should kind of break down the next steps to it. The biggest point of all the things I'm going to be making is practice. I can't stress that more enough. When it comes to using these controls, there are a lot of things that will make sense right away, and then other things that will make zero sense until you physically put something in front of you and take a picture while controlling just those settings. So jumping into it a little bit more, why do we go advanced point and shoot DSLR or mirrorless? I would say the next big reason that we start to get more advanced on there is to, again, for the same things I just said, is we're trying to push past the limitations of what our automatic setting has to do. We're pushing past the limitations that our basic or traditional camera has, and we're trying to master this. For the, for majority of photography's existence, it was something that you controlled manually. You didn't have automatic settings and features. DSLR cameras popularized that, and even the very beginning DSLRs had none of that. And now these mirrorless cameras, which have so much technology and advancements in there, are amazing with automatic. However, it's still that art and craft of using the camera and fully understanding what each knob, dial, and little button does. So that's why you want to go more advanced, is you want to really master the craft of photography, understand it as a tool, as a use to get something more out of your photos. And so the first thing I talk about is what I think is the difference between a photograph and a snapshot. I look at a snapshot as a quick picture that you're taking, something that's just easy, it's really mindless for the most part. You point and you shoot. You're not controlling anything on the camera, you're not deliberately setting anything up, you're not going through the different settings and fixtures of the camera to get something that's more precious. And if we flip-flop that and we say, now what then is a photograph, we'll take this image and we'll spruce it up a little bit, and we'll take the picture of the same thing using fully customized settings. So this photo and the photo I showed before are the same area that we took a picture of. The only difference is that with this photo, I manipulated the camera's settings, and I made it more on the manual settings. So for ISO, we toned that down to about 100, maybe 50 on that one. We were low lit. However, with that being said, the light that is coming from the area that I'm in radiates more inside the camera. We changed the light metering mode, so that way the mode itself was more focused on the center of the image, giving us these nicer tones in our light. We made sure that the image was level and that we were in the center, so that way we had symmetrical lines as we're kind of moving up into this area. And then as far as shutter was concerned, we didn't really have to worry about that because we're indoors, nothing's moving. Maybe the escalator's moving a little bit, but not fast enough that it would determine anything that we needed. And for aperture, for the most part, most of this is in focus, but I will say that this is probably the crispest part of the image. So aperture is probably going to be somewhere at about a 5.6 to 6, which again might not make a lot of sense right now, but as we start breaking down each of those settings, it'll make more. So again, when we look at something like a snapshot, it's quick, it's mindless, we're not changing the settings, we're not controlling or manipulating our camera's features, we're just taking the picture. This could be done on automatic, this could be done with a cell phone, this could be done with anything.
That's amazing.
When we come down to then a photograph, in my mind, it's the actual use of the camera, playing with those knobs and dials, and really dialing something more creative in. So, step one, as we talked about last week for a refresh, learn the camera. There are so many different models. I made this slide like a year ago, and to just give you some context, Nikon has about 5 new cameras, Canon has about 3 new cameras, and Sony probably has about 7 brand new cameras since then. So every couple years there's a refresh, a new model comes out, something stronger, something faster, something better than before comes to replace what's already is. So first and foremost, whatever camera you bought, take a look, learn about it, research it online. I'm a strong believer in YouTube. I think that you can get some of the best information out of YouTube. Let me just see too, I'm gonna make sure.
Maybe you covered this last week.
Yeah,
What is
we're good.
APS-C?
So they're crop sensor and full frame, and we did. So with crop sensor, it's a little bit of a faster camera, but it doesn't have as big of a sensor size, meaning that the editing and what you can do to it in post is more limited. It's great if you are a hobbyist to semi-professional. If you're getting more into the professional realm, then a full frame camera is what you want because you have more manipulation and more things that you can play with. Full frame has more megapixels. Typically it has better resolution quality. Usually it also gives you more of a color bit, which we talk more about in advanced class next week. That refers more to the editing and the post-production side of photography. But as far as just standard, whatever it is you're trying to take pictures of, crop sensor usually comes in at a lower price point too, which makes it much more lucrative, and it's a little bit quicker because the sensor's not that big.
Yeah.
And the Nikon, the bottom row, are
Yes.
those all the new Z?
No, this one's a Z mount, and that's really about it. Those are all just
And
DSLRs.
so that was the big fat one is the
D6,
D6.
that should be the D850.
okay. And the metal one?
That metal one is an old, I believe it was called, I forgot what that was. It's been years since I've seen that one, but I do love the retro look on Nikon. That's why I went with this
Yeah,
model
so-
myself. I like the dials. I have a Canon AE1 at home that every once in a while I break out and I load a roll of film in there, and it's just so much fun. So I do love all the film cameras, and I like the retro look that Nikon still does.
So the D6 is not worth buying. You should go to the
You should absolutely go to the mirrorless.
mirrorless.
Yeah,
Okay.
Z9 would be the one that you want to look for the D6. The direct alternative would either be the Z9, or if you want something closer to that body, Z8.
Okay, thank you.
So learn the camera, step one, familiarize yourself with the tool that you have. Now, getting more into it, the big thing we talked about last week was the mode dial when we broke down the buttons and the layouts. That was one of the big things we talked about. I like to think of the mode dial as your gear shift in your car. It's your way of moving from park to reverse to neutral to drive. In the same boat of you using your camera, it's your ability to switch between manual mode or aperture or shutter or priority auto or whatever it is. Every mode dial looks a little bit different. When we talked last week, I recommended you stick with the green usually, or auto, or AI, depending on the camera that you have. Everybody's got it a little bit differently written on their camera. However, now we really want to break down what the other dials mean and then talk a little bit more about it. So your next steps are always auto and program auto. The way I break those down, automatic, it does everything for you. The only thing you really do is pick the picture you want, hit the trigger, and take the picture. Program auto, now you have the ability to change some things like ISO, exposure compensation, light metering, your focus parameters, your brackets on that. Things that could make an automatic photo still look a little bit more complex because you now have just some slight control over settings and features. However, things like aperture, things like shutter, and things like ISO can all stay automatic. Aperture priority, which we'll break down in just a moment, is going to be your priority on just aperture. So everything else stays automatic. You just have control over the iris or the aperture of the camera. Shutter is the speed at which the shutters are closing and opening, so the speed at which we're taking the photo. Good for action, good for movement. But just like aperture only focuses on aperture priority, shutter is only going to focus on the priority of the shutter. Everything else will be automatic.
Excuse me. And on this camera, where's all those? Is it
With this one, you hold down the mode button,
okay.
and as you then hold down the mode button, you then turn this dial in the back. Then you switch between everything.
Okay.
So I'll put you back on.
Well, you look at it in
Yeah,
here.
I'll put you back on the P program.
Thank you.
When it comes to full manual, everything that's set at a priority on it is now all under full manual. So now you have control over aperture, over shutter, over your exposure compensation, over your ISO, and over all the other things that are available to you in Program Automatic too. So now you fully wheel and deal while you're using the camera. What we're going to do is break down the aperture, the shutter, the ISO, and then how they're all separate but come together. And the best way to break that down is by explaining the exposure triangle. Now, the reason they call it the triangle is because typically in textbooks they'll show it as a triangle shape. The reason I don't like doing that is because a lot of the times when people see that, they think, okay, once I change this and this and that I'm done. It's not necessarily the case. When we're doing full manual control, one important thing I like to say right off the bat is just because I switched my aperture to a certain number, and I switched my shutter to a certain number, and I switched my ISO to a certain number, doesn't mean the photo is going to be perfect. It might mean that we need to readjust some of these things to then make it work. It's the same thing as we edit photos. When you're getting into photo editing, as you need to and you change things, you're going to realize that, okay, now I need to go back and re-look at that to then make sure it's perfect. There's no one way to take a photo of something. We just kind of have to go off of past experience and what we've learned to figure out what the correct use of all these numbers are. So the first one I'm going to start with is aperture. We're going to break that down. Now, the way I look at aperture, there's two really easy ways. First off, again, real smart scientists created these lenses way back in the day. They figured out the way to control a mechanical shutter. I did not. But the way that you can think about this is your eyeball. If you look at your eyeball, you've got a little black part in there, that's the iris. As you are exposed to more light, your iris shrinks in size because it doesn't need to let so much light in. That's why when you're getting out of bed and you flip the bathroom lights on at 4 in the morning, it hurts because your iris was massive for you to see in the dark and see everything. But then when you turn light on, you're being a harsh reality to your eyes. This is in a similar boat doing the same thing. The smaller it is, though, the more crisp our whole image is from foreground to background. So when we're at an f22, larger number, smaller iris, we're going to be able to see the background and the foreground together. No separation of the two. It's going to let the least amount of light in, though. On the flip side, though, if we get down to 1.4, which is pretty wide open, there's nothing on the sides there, we're blurring out the background completely, and our subject matter is in full focus. So the way I like to look at this is if you're taking a photo of something, and I have examples after this to really drive this at home. If you're taking a photo of something and you don't care about the background, you want to take a perfect portrait, you can go ahead and blur the entire background out and just focus in on your subject matter. If you are trying to get more of the background into it, you might then want to go for a higher number. And if you don't need to get this entire image, but you want to get something of the background in it, that's where the flexibility of having it comes from. That's why they don't just automatically go 1.2 or then 22. There's that in between in there, so that way you get to pick and choose what you want. You might also need to replay with or play with these as you're going to let more light in because of your environment and your situation. If you're in an area that's overcast or dark or nighttime or indoor photography like a club or a promoting situation, then you might need to have something that's a little more wide open, but then you still want to get the background and show things off, so then you play with certain numbers and everything else.
So would you have to change the aperture priority?
Yes, so if you're just on aperture priority and you're just controlling this, you're fine. The camera's going to do the rest of the work for you, so you don't have to worry about any of that. So for me, one of the things that, and actually I'll say it at the very end, I'll save that part for last, but for aperture priority, you're just focusing on this part of the camera function, and the camera's doing the rest of the work for you. So for ISO and shutter, it's doing the rest.
Okay, stupid question.
Sure.
How do I change the aperture on this one?
On this guy, when you have it turned on,
Because I usually change it with the
sometimes
lens.
there's a ring.
Yeah.
You don't have that ring on this type of lens.
Right.
So in this case, you're going to change the aperture. So if I click on your mode, and I scroll through, let's get you to, there it is. So
Okay.
from right there, the very front, it's this dial there, and you can see on the top right corner how it's changing the dials.
Okay, and that coordinates with the
That
lens.
coordinates with the lens.
Thank you.
Some lenses
I usually do a manual with the lens now.
Some lenses have that, like my lens does, for example, right? When I'm trying to control my aperture on there, and anybody watching on home too, when I'm trying to control my aperture, I can just turn my dial over here, and then it'll change my aperture for me.
That's what I like.
On some of the cameras, instead of it being there, it's going to be in a dial that's on the camera. So like, for example, some of your cameras have it where you have two dials on there, one in the front and one in the back. When you're using manual control, that's where you're able to then control the difference between there's my shutter, there's my aperture. And those rings then let me spin and control that. So sometimes it'll be on the lens, sometimes it'll be in the camera. It just depends on what you're shooting with. So when we look at that, again, that's what we're supposed to be thinking about. How much of what we need, how much light do we need to let in, what are we trying to get after? So it's tough when I'm shooting indoor photography and I'm using full manual control. F22, if I really want to get the entirety of the scene, both the background, the foreground, and just everything in between, then I've really got to make sure I'm readjusting my ISO to let more light sensitivity in. Playing with the shutter, maybe making it slower so that way I can get all the detail because it's not a lot of light that it's letting in. If we're doing aperture priority, the camera does the rest of the thinking for you. So this is a great way to get away from full automatic while still retaining a lot of the camera's intellectual parts, if that makes sense. You're focusing on one manual control of the camera without getting yourself too deep in the nitty-gritty. Some examples I have to kind of drive this at home. I'm a big dog guy. Squirrels are still cute, but I like dogs. So if we look at the dog's nose, we can see that the nose of the dog is in full focus. This is definitely the sweet spot of the image. However, as we break away from the nose, we can see the lip on the bottom starts to get a little bit hazy, and right there, the eye and the ear and everything else. So there's two things that we can think of, and this might pertain perfect for you, is that the main focus of our image is on the nose. We can change focus parameters up, so that way maybe it gets a wider space, so we can probably include in the whole part of the dog's face, or we could change our aperture so we don't blur the background out as much. If we're looking at just this image on the left though, and we compare it to our chart from the last one, I would say that we're probably looking at something around a 5.6, maybe a 4, possibly an 8. Somewhere between these three numbers is what that image on the left is reading for us. Because you can still make out that it's a dog, just like you can make out that it's a pyramid behind the person who's waving, yet a lot of the detail is missing because it's blurred out. So like, where are the eyes? Can't really tell where the dog's looking. We can see it's a pink collar, we can see some of the brown stripes, but I'm sure there's other color within the dog's complexion that we're missing because of the blurred background. Yet, we have a very nice close-up of the nose. Bring that over to the squirrel, and now we even have more backgrounds blurring going on. We can probably deduce that given the green, and given that there's a piece of wood right here, that this is some sort of bush, tree, shrub, something that's nature imposed, but we can't really make out the finer details of that. As far as the squirrel is concerned, the focus is all on the squirrel, and that's where our main kind of point of view. I would say really specifically it's the eye. It starts to get a little blurry at the nut that it's eating or shooting. But regardless, that's what you're really getting. So this I probably, if I look back at the chart again, 1.4, maybe 2 as far as what we're getting on that, because from when we look at the 22 part, the F22, we can see the background and the foreground. When we get down to something like this, we're really losing that we're losing that background.
I have a quick question.
Yes.
So does that become really difficult, like when the animals are moving and so they're at a different distance, like within a couple seconds?
Not necessarily. That's where it's great because you have things like autofocus continuous.
Okay.
On Canon, I believe it's just called servo mode.
Okay.
that's where then what it's doing is the camera's going to continuously lock onto your target and just keep then bringing the camera's lens innerts back and forth to make sure it locks in on them. So no, it's not necessarily more difficult. Depends on your camera, it depends on the speed of the camera, and it also could depend on the other settings that you have. But if you're just using the aperture priority with then the autofocus continuous being on, you shouldn't have any difficulty.
Okay.
Another way to look at it too, deep versus shallow. You got the dog in the center there. You've got something that has something closer to an f/22, maybe down to an f/16.8, maybe around that part. And then that's where you get more into that 1.2, 1.4. If we were taking what's the term I'm looking for, a portrait of this dog, this might be the better choice for us because then we really just have our focus on the target. But if we want to get the entire scenery for it, then we might want to do something a little bit larger than that. The other thing too I like about this one that I realized later on is if you look at the dog's image, on the left side, that eye is really dark, and on this side, the eye is really clear. Think about that too with the light you're letting in. Because we're letting in less light on this side, the image is going to appear to be darker. Yet, when we add more light on for this, because now we're blurring the background out, we're opening our camera's iris up all the way, we're really getting in the coloration and the lighter parts of the dog's fur. So there's pros and cons to both. I think I have one more chart that shows that off. Oh, no I don't. But why use aperture priority? And I think that this image kind of is a nice way of that. The scenery is beautiful, and if you're trying to take a portrait of somebody or just a really nice photo that doesn't necessarily lock into one space, getting the entirety of the image is a really nice thing to do. And having the flexibility of just controlling one aspect of the camera to get what you're trying to get there is a really nice feature. If we just wanted to focus in on her and really get rid of the background, number one, we probably just wouldn't stand somewhere like this because this is just a nice background. But if we were, then we could blur this entire thing out and just focus in on her. But in this case, if you're on vacation, a honeymoon, a wedding, whatever it might be, or just a fun trip, you might want to take a photo like this to really savor in the fact that you get to see something like this. So, using aperture priority, you're just wanting to control one thing, and that's the foreground to background separation of your camera. You're also controlling how much light you're letting into the camera without necessarily getting into the more manual focus of both shutter and ISO. Next thing we have is shutter speed. So shutter priority is going to be our next topic. When it comes to shutter, the way that we can look at this is that everything happens in 1 second. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi, same idea. But if we were taking photos and it took a second for us to take that photo, every photo we took would be blurry unless we had a tripod. So we deal with fractions. I don't like math, but it makes it pretty simple when you start to get used to it. The higher the number, the faster within the second that we're moving. The lower the number, the closer to that second that we're getting. So if this person is a running person, and they're, let's say it's our kid or somebody that we know and they're running track and field, if they're running, we want to use something faster in order to get that motion. Because if we can capture them faster than a second, we should be able to get a nice, clean, still image of that person, less blurry. And that's what you're really seeing here. So at 1/500th of a second, the person's in perfect clarity. Even at 250 and 1/25th of a second, they're pretty clear. As we slowly start to go down on speed though, we're going to notice that how much more blur comes into effect with that. How much lighter our image starts to become because of that. So at a half a second, with that person running at the same speed, it basically would be completely blurry.
So you put it on shutter and then you can go with the
Then you
speed.
can just control.
Like 8,000 is like really super
That's
fast.
real fast, yes. And that's, I think, the next one that I have. For freezing action shots, 1 in 1,000 or faster is usually always required. Something like this picture, just given how fast the surfer is moving, given how fast the white rapids of the water are, whenever you see whites of the water, it's moving very, very quickly. To get something this still, you're probably looking at 1 in 225/100th of a second. I always hate doing the parentheses, or the ifs at the very end. But like something like that takes speed. It takes your camera moving faster. So if you've got high velocity action photography, things that are moving at great speeds, cars, hawks. I don't think dogs will move that fast, but I know we're getting ready for the cruise, correct? Yes, so you're gonna have the whales. Yes,
So 1,000 and higher.
1,000 and higher. If you've got something that's gonna be making a big movement, and that's gonna move, within a split second, setting that speed to be faster than about 1,000 is usually a good starting point.
So how would you change that? You put it on shutter priority.
And then once you have it turned on, you should be able to use either one of the dials on the back there. So for you, so for here, it's probably the front dial. Yep, it's the front dial up there. It's what's speed.
Okay.
So because you have one of the, you have like with your camera and your camera, if you're using full manual, it would both those dials work. The top would work for shutter, the back would work for aperture. In this case, when you switch over to those priority modes, it's only going to let you move the one dial. When you try to move the other, no numbers, nothing's going to change. You might have 2 dials too on yours. You got one.
This thing?
You got one dial. You got that one there. And then you have anything on the back? Yeah, you have this one technically. Cool. So both.
If I want to take a picture of the fountain
Mhm.
and just capture that water,
Probably around that 1 1,000th of a second, because that's what's going to be moving. Think about how fast the water is moving, especially maybe not necessarily in the like lighter ones that are spurting up,
Right.
but in the center of that fountain, the way that it's shooting into the air. If you're at the Bellagio, same idea. You're going to want to view something faster in order to get those tiny little particles. Otherwise, these are going to look a lot more blurry.
yeah.
So you do this shutter here, and what about the lens? What do you put it on that?
Nothing.
You can leave it on manual?
Well, so manual is just for your focus. That's just for you to
Okay.
get whatever it is
So
in
you can
focus.
focus
Yeah.
manually and then speed here and on.
Exactly. The speed is what's dictating how fast your camera's going to chop that image.
Sure.
Now, in that same boat, when we're using speed, we can give a sense of motion. The one thing I always talk about, blur is not always a bad thing within photography. There are millions of artists out there who have been paid a lot of money to get things that are blurry. When you're getting something that moves, it might be hard to get something still. One of the things that we talked about last week was that drive mode button, clicking the squares that then do that like the sports photography guys. That's where then something like that could be really helpful to get this in perfect stillness. But if you're out in the field, you see this hummingbird just kind of bouncing around places. Hummingbirds, if I remember reading, I think they move their wings. It's like
3,200th of a second.
it's amazing how
I used
fast
to
they
take,
are.
I'm from Ecuador, they
Yeah.
used to do that a lot.
Yeah, but it's amazing how fast they move. It's incredible. When you think they just hover there. I love when you watch videos of it too. There's certain videos, if you get them right, where the shutter of the video doesn't move fast enough, so it literally looks like the bird's wings aren't even moving. It's just like bouncing up and down. I'm like, that's really cool. So you can tell it got a bug in its mouth, but look at how nice and saturated all the colors are. You get the blues, the yellows, the green, all the different brown textures out of there, and then on top of that too, the red and pink of the beak. Mixed then with the wings that are extremely blurry and in focus but out of focus, you can really get some pretty images that have blur to them, but they give a nice sense of motion, that something happened. The other thing that using shutter speed is great for is creating mood with long exposures. So the other way to think about this when it comes to shutter is not only can you capture an image faster, you can also capture an image slower. Depending on what you're trying to take pictures of, you can create a lot of depth of field and character within the image with not necessarily needing to do too much other than just set the camera on what's called beat, so bulb. Now, with something like this, given how nice all the foliage is within exposure and within saturation, this is a long exposure picture. You can also see some of the areas where the water is extremely blurry. That would also give us an indication of long exposure on a photo. Where this is unique is because if you look at how detailed everything is, you can tell that this was an aperture that's probably a 22 or a 32, meaning that the whole frame is in focus. There's no background to foreground separation. But what we're doing is, because there's little light being let in, and because of how fast this is moving, we probably wouldn't want to do a quick, type of shot. You would want to let the sensor stay open for a while to collect color, to collect depth of field within their shadows and everything else. You can see how the foliage gets broken up by some dead shrubs, by the leaves of a tree, some branches that cut through, all the way then you come into some more, the rocks and then the actual sticks and branches. I didn't think about what that word was. And then you get the actual moss that's growing on the rocks. But you see the color that comes through. The other thing within the water is you see the streaks of water where it's continuously falling. Where it's hazy is that kind of sporadic nature of the water where it's bouncing in all different directions. The camera can only pick up so much. But when we look real close, you can see how detailed that is, how many tiny little crevices are on that waterfall to make up for the pattern in which the water is falling. Being able to keep the sensor open for 5 seconds, 10 seconds can really help create awesome mood pictures that give that sense of motion, but they really then kind of play out what the long exposure is good for. This is how astrophotography works too. Setting it up on a tripod, pointing your camera, getting all your settings set up properly, and then just hitting the trigger, letting it stay open for a period of time, and then closing. That detail that it picks up on is what really creates the saturation and what I'm saying when I say mood.
So real quick question, I just put it on manual and I can control the aperture and the shutter.
Yep.
Thank you.
Of course. So again, another way to look at it when it comes to shutter speed on another chart, the slower we go, let's say that 1/60th and 1/30th of a second are kind of our middle points. We're not necessarily too slow, but we're not too fast. If the person's kind of moving and they're moving fast enough, it'll be a little bit blurry. The slower we go, the brighter, the more light it comes in. So that's where with long exposure, you can really play with that a little bit more, especially if you're using a not so, like a not a 1.4 or 1.2 aperture. If we then do that though, we'll get more blur of the motion. So we gotta make sure that this camera is real stationary and tight, and we gotta make sure that whatever we're taking photos of maybe isn't moving that much. On the flip side of that though, the faster we go, the more we freeze motion. We really can get a still image. On the flip side of that though, it's gonna get darker as we go because we're letting less light come into the camera because we're closing the shutters so fast. So much like how aperture priority as the kind of trade-ons and trade-offs of, okay, if I let more light into the camera, I won't get a lot of the background with the foreground. If I don't let a lot of light into the camera though, I can get more of both the background and the foreground, but then the camera's got to readjust for all that. In shutter, same boat. The higher we go with the speed, probably the smaller the aperture is going to get. We're going to get closer to that 1.4, 1.2 kind of area if our lens allows for it. If we're going to go brighter, or we do something longer, we're probably going to get an aperture that lets less light in, so that way it can compensate for what the camera's about to do.
So if you go like below 125, you should kind of use a tripod, right?
I'd say so. Yeah, if you're going below, I'd say 1/30th of a second, you're probably going to want to use a tripod. I sometimes have done it for 45 seconds on long exposure to do something like an astrophotography once, and it was a long time. And when you think about 45 seconds, it doesn't seem like that long of a time. Just stand still for 45 seconds and watch it on your watch. It feels like you've slowed down time completely. It's like watching paint dry. Same idea when it comes to photography. If you're going to do something that's longer, then you're probably going to need a tripod. I'd say anything shorter or longer than 1/30th of a second, you'll see some sort of blur. If there's nothing going on and you've got a steady hand, you probably can get away with it. But for the most part, even if it's just slight motion, like if you throw something or like drop something, take a photo of it that slow, you'll see that movement.
So you're saying you could counteract the brightness or the darkness of whatever you put your shutter speed to with changing the aperture?
Yes, that's where the full manual control comes into play.
Okay.
That's where adjusting 1 or 2 can really help with that kind of thing. If you're doing just the priority mode though, you should trust that your camera's going to do the readjustment for you. This is a good way of learning kind of the different settings without having to like fully dive into manual. So like, yeah.
Cool.
Why use shutter priority? This was also a photo that a customer emailed to me. I like using those types of things in my show. This would be a great example of it. They're probably playing Ultimate Frisbee. They're in downtown Chicago. They're in Lincoln Park there. And just trying to throw this thing around, you can see that the image doesn't look right. It looks kind of cool when you think about it, but it's just the motion, everything else just looks really blotchy. If we could just use aperture priority mode, speed things up, do the 1 in 1,000th or faster speed, we probably could have caught these in freezing motions. Maybe change the drive so that way it's that continuous rapid fire. We could also use full manual control, but without confusing ourselves and diving into something that we might not necessarily have full control over yet or full understanding. If we know we're going to be in an environment where things are going to move quickly, try shutter priority. If we're going to be in an area where all we care about is background to foreground separation, try aperture priority. I know those two kind of sound weird and you have to think about it a little bit, but when you're going out on vacation or taking photos around the house or getting into whatever your business practices and you're trying to figure out how to create content, think of those two questions as you're about to take pictures of whatever it is and choose and pick one, especially if you want to get away from automatic. That's what I would recommend to start.
And how do you change the shutter again? You press the mode and then you change
Yep.
it?
So then you go to the S, and then now you're in the S, so you let go of the mode. Now you can control the very front. Sorry, it's this back one.
On the back one?
Yep, so you can see that number changing.
Thank you.
And the last thing to tie everything together is ISO. Way back in the day when you had film, you would buy your Ilford, your Fuji, your Kodak, your Portra, there's a few other brands I can't think of off the top of my head, but you'd buy your film and the film would have a number next to it. It would say Ilford 100, Kodak 400, Portra 800. What that number represented was sensitivity to the light. So what scientists and engineers basically figured out is that if we're going to do a DSLR camera, digital camera, it doesn't need film, how do we compensate for that? Well, now we have ISO. ISO has a very long name to it. I don't know it. I'm not going to tell you it. But what it really is good for is it's the sensitivity of light that your sensor is getting into the camera. The lower the number is, the more light that's available to you, so the less sensitive it has to be. The higher the number is, the more sensitive your sensor is, which is great for lower, darker areas that you're taking pictures of. So in this case, we take 4 pictures of the same thing, and we can see that the lighting in this probably isn't that good. It's sunset from what I'm seeing, or maybe sunrise, probably more so sunset, just given the colors. You can see that right off the bat, by changing the ISO throughout them, it changes the mood of the photo. So like when I took my picture of that escalator over on the right side of our atrium there, when I was taking that photo, by changing the number and making it slightly darker, I let less light into the camera, which gave me a more moody looking photo. If I don't want mood, I want more of just the entirety of the image, I want the saturation, I want the color, maybe I raise it a little bit more and get all of the even distribution of light and color throughout. That way I can see more details. Things like the beach or the dark pier or the ripples in the water and even that shadow underneath the water can get lost in something like the 100. But as we change that number and bring it up, it's going to help bring in more light to the camera, which opens those areas up a little bit more.
So that replaces the film 100,
Exactly.
400.
Exactly.
So
That's you using your judgment to say, okay, well, I'm in this, maybe we're in this room. There's not a lot of good light in this room. Depending on the cameras that you have, they might be awesome for low light sensitivity, they might be awful for it. If that's the case, then we might want to play with the ISO in order to figure out what the next steps would be. What should I change this to? What should I lower this to or raise it to in order to help me counteract the lighting and the situation I'm in?
So if you're in a real bright spot, you can go down to 100.
Yeah, exactly. And if you're in a real dark spot, 800 or plus might be a good option. Now the other thing we'll talk about is auto ISO, but I'm gonna save that for the end. Another example of it, just to kind of drive it all in, 1600, it's clear as day, you still see the rainbow and the color. I would say that 800, you make things darker, but I would probably beg to say that the rainbow itself looks much more saturated or bright than the 800. 400, you get too dark, 200, too dark, 100, you barely can see anything, but the rainbow is still there. So it's that ability to play with it and kind of figure it out. Like I said, I think when I was teaching the first class, I will do this tendency of, I'll set a still life up when I buy a lens, and I might put, something that's shiny, something that's matte, something that's made of plastic, something that's made of metal. I'll put a light somewhere on the image, and then I'll take pictures of it, and I'll change certain things, like aperture. ISO, I usually only do it when I get brand new camera body, just to really drive in like what that ISO will look like. When it comes to a lens, I'll sit there and take a picture of something, and I'll have it at 1.4. Then I'll raise it up a click to 1.6, 1.8, 2, 2.2, 2.4, 2.8, that sort of thing. And just kind of look at the differences in between. It might be a nuisance or just kind of a strenuous thing, but it helps. It helps understand what I just bought, what I'm doing.
Doesn't ISO also has to do with speed? Like if you...
Not necessarily. I mean, the more light you let in, the more it helps your photo.
Okay.
So if you're gonna do, let's say, I'll say yes and no to your question. Yes, in the sense of if I have my speed set at a high number and I'm getting dark images, ISO is going to help me bring more light into it because it's going to make my sensor of my camera more sensitive towards it. So just because I'm closing the shutter faster means I'm still drawing in as much light as possible. No, in the same way that if you set your shutter to a certain number and it's still too fast, it doesn't matter if you jack your ISO up to the highest, which is Sony at the current moment at 204,000 ISO. It might still do no good for you. So it's dependent. ISO though and noise go hand in hand. So if you grew up with tube TVs and you understand the static in the television, ISO can relate to the noise, which is like that static. If we look at the left side of the image, we can see that at ISO 100, it's clean, it's nice, there's no kind of deformities all over the image. As we raise that ISO up though, we start to get that pixelation, that choppiness, that kind of just static, if you will. And that's because if we turn our ISO too high, given that we have good light sourcing, it's going to affect the image negatively and overpower the sensor, telling it to bring in too much light. The other thing that can happen too is as you turn the ISO up, you might start to notice that the image gets just washed out with color. It just turns white, or it turns completely black. That's because you have too little or too much ISO. So play with ISO, understand it more. But one of the things that I strongly recommend to most everybody is auto ISO. When to use it, the best example I have is that there's this mom who was coming in for a couple weeks for camera lessons here, and she was getting ready to take pictures of her kid's prom. And she was like, I'm not going to be at the dance, but we're taking pictures at one person's house. Then we're going over here to take pictures in front of a waterfall. Then one of the families wants to take pictures indoors at this place. And it was the fact that she was going to be going in to outdoors and changing the lighting and the locations. Rather than having to putz around with ISO, if she just switched to auto ISO, the camera's going to do that work for her. I'm a strong proponent and user of auto ISO. I typically will use automatic ISO when I'm shooting. Not saying that I don't use regular ISO, but it is in more controlled environments where I can read the light really well and say, okay, well, I'm indoors, lighting is suspended about 50, 60 feet. Maybe I'm going to set my ISO to 400 because I'm getting good saturation, but I just need a little bit more on the other features that I have. Instead of it being auto ISO, where then it might bounce from one to the other and fluctuate, I'm controlling that part myself and manipulating it. That's your call on it. I strongly, though, think that for most people, if you use auto ISO on your photos, you'll be more than happy.
And how do you switch from auto to...
That's in the menu. So you go to the menu, you find your ISO settings, which should be under the picture control. From there, then you should be able to set your ISO to auto instead of whatever the number is. For other cameras, you'll go into the menu settings of the camera in the front, so either the Q or the I button. You'll find ISO, and you should be able to select and choose. Typically, if you're on automatic, either P or regular A automatic, it's not going to let you, just as a heads up. So you need to either be in a priority mode, like shutter or aperture, or you need to be in full manual to get control of of auto ISO. Last thing I'll show is this little chart, and then I'll show some photos. I'll tell you what I see in there, and if you see something different, you can comment and say something. But if we look at aperture to fully review again, the higher the number, the more of the image, foreground and background we're going to see. We got two piggies sitting on the couch. You can see the background. As we move into the 1.4, they're still sitting in the same spot. The background becomes really hard for us to see. When we're shooting with ISO or with our shutter speed, the faster the shutter speed goes, the more in clarity we get the whole image. Hammer hitting the nail into a board, we can see the hand, we can see the hammer, we can see the board. As we start to slow this down, the only thing we're going to see still is the board, because that's the only thing that's not moving in the image. The hand and the hammer almost become non-existent because we're not capturing them fast enough in order to see them. And when it comes down to ISO, the lower the number is, the more light saturation we should be having in the area, giving us more color, giving us proper lighting, just giving us proper, let's say, separation of objects and the relationship between them. The higher we start to turn that ISO up, the more light we're bringing into the image, meaning the more washed out our image can become. But then also on top of that, the more pixelated or noisy that our image can become. So in this case of reviewing a triangle, the reason I don't use the triangle setting on there, and I like to use this chart, is because when you look at this, it's not just let me play this one here, this there, and then change my ISO to 400, and that's the perfect picture. It takes time to understand why am I setting my f-stop to certain numbers? Why am I setting my shutter speed to certain numbers? Do I feel comfortable mixing those together, or do I want to keep them as priority only? I personally, for my own fun photography that I do, I shoot on aperture priority. I just like the control of the foreground to background separation. And for the most part, I'm shooting wide open at the 1.4, and I'm not going down to the bigger numbers. If I really am going down to the bigger numbers, I'll sometimes hit the middle, so 8, 5.6, maybe 11 or 16, but I'm not going to go all the way up to 22. On my current lens from Sony, I have the ability to only go up to 16 at the highest. So that 22, that 32 that you might see on some of the entry-level lenses, I won't have that on this one. So everyone's lens is a little bit different. For example, the new lens that I'm picking up is the 24-70 GM2 from Sony. That can go all the way up to 22 as far as the aperture is concerned. And again, that's nice, like we were looking at on the chart, but again, it depends on what we're trying to accomplish and get at.
So when you say you use mostly aperture priority, what kind of pictures are you taking?
Depends on what I'm doing. A lot of the times, if this is the camera I'm using, this is my professional vacation photographer camera, where I'm going out, I'm enjoying myself, I want to make sure I have memories for everything. I care about the distance between objects and my background to foreground separation. I'd say landscape, architecture, just standard street photography where I'm trying to maybe capture somebody walking by and it looks really cool. That's where I'll play with that. If I'm going to something that I know a lot of movement's going to be happening, then I'll switch to my shutter priority. And then when I'm doing my professional work where I'm actually going to events and doing photos for, you know, whatever it might be, auctions or silent, or I keep using auctions, that was the last thing I did. Charity fundraisers, polar plunge. I'm going to use shutter. I'm going to use full manual because I want to make sure I have that control over both my aperture and my shutter to make sure I'm getting the full frame into place and I'm getting the speed dialed in based on what I'm seeing.
So when you say you do landscape photography, wouldn't you be blurring out some of the background of the landscape?
If I shoot wide open, yes. But if I'm not, the 16, I get the whole thing. And then my camera will then readjust for everything else.
So that picture you had of the woman standing on the rocks, where it was all in focus.
That would have been 22 or 16. That would have been the highest number on the lens that you could do. So instead of it being 1.4, where I'm getting all the light let in, I'm going to move up to that 16, and that should then make my iris real tiny on the camera, let less light in, but it'll get everything into focus. Next thing I'll talk about is the exposure meter. When it comes to exposure meter, the exposure makes things lighter or darker. You'll see it on there. It's usually that little white and black box, has a slash going through with a check mark or a plus and a minus. When we go to positive numbers, that'll raise the exposure, making the whole image brighter. If we go to the negative numbers, or the lower ones, we're going to then get a darker exposure. A lot of people ask me what the difference between this and ISO is. ISO is the sensitivity of your whole image. This would be like if you ever got to be in a dark room, if you left the photo under the exposing unit for too long, it would either look Too little, too light, too much, too dark. That's the same idea with exposure, is that on this you can make your image lighter or darker. You can do it during post as well too, but if you're really trying to make sure you got the image, you can play with it on this. Doing this will affect what your ISO is. You might need to readjust the ISO again. If you're using auto ISO, then it should automatically readjust for you.
That's just to make the picture darker or lighter.
Exactly. Light metering, another one. Light metering is all about how your camera sensor is understanding the light and basically running a meter on that. So again, think about it this way. If you take your lens off and you look at the center of your camera, you've got that multicolored, kind of looks like oil slick sensor on the inside. That sensor can read lights without really seeing what it needs to see. So for example, if you try to take a picture with no lens on there, it's going to look blurry, there's nothing there, it won't read the image. It needs the glass in order to see what it's about to take a picture of. But if we break that down and go from there, the sensor will have certain points on there where it's reading and seeing the light and going from there. So or matrix or evaluative, multiple, there's many different names for the different brands. That's going to look at light from different points of the sensor. So if we look at Nikon, for example, it's going to hit the four corners and the center. For Sony, it's going to hit the four corners and the center. Canon, it's going to hit the center and then the surrounding area of that. That's where Canon, for a lot of people, gets its best color. And people really love the Canon color because of how the evaluative sensor for light metering works.
And you're not changing that, the lens does it for you.
No, you are changing it. So this is something in the camera settings that you can change. It's the light meter settings. This is something that gets more advanced with it, and that's why I think it's important to look at it when you get into the intermediate, because this is all stuff you can change if you want. The other thing though is that your camera does what's called automatic light metering, where it does the work for you, you don't have to think about it. But I do like playing with light metering, and I think that I used the example with you, Keith, one time when we were in. The way I look at it is if you ever see a painting by Caravaggio, very famous painter, but he was a master manipulator of the way light bounced and reflected off things. And when he painted, he would be able to paint and get the color right if you just had a candle lit in front of you and it was radiating light off of the sides. If you're standing in front of a candle, the back of your head isn't getting that warm light from the candle. It's the front of your face. So that being said, the light metering that a camera does kind of does the same thing, where it finds and pinpoints where the light's coming from, emphasizes that, and builds the light in relationship to other parts of the photo. So you can play with light metering if you find it interesting. I think it can help dramatize your photos a little bit, add a little flair to it, but just really intensify where the light is coming from. And light is probably one of the most important parts of how our cameras work. Without it, we would see nothing.
And where do you find the light metering?
Usually it's in the menu settings. You'll find the light metering, and then from there you can play with the different numbers. Also could be if you press the I button, it takes you to the quick menu setup, and you should be able to then find where the light metering is there too. Now, I'll show you at the end. Center looks at the light in the middle and anything radiating from it, very similar to evaluative. Spot, only from the center portion of it and nothing else. So it doesn't radiate, it only picks up on the one spot in the center. And again, I put this little chart up there because every camera brand is different. Nobody does it the same way as everybody else. They either add something on, they take something away. They're all a little different on how they choose to run these. So keep that in mind when you're getting a camera and you're getting into it. You might see something on one, you might not see it on the other. Again, it depends. Auto white balance, or white balance as a whole. Now these are presets on the camera that affect the white balance that you have. The way you can look at this is that the color white is going to be present in anything that you're doing. It's kind of a mixing point in a lot of different colors. What's going to happen though is as you're taking pictures, the sun never has the same consistency of rays. That's why you have incandescent light bulbs, fluorescent light bulbs. You have a warm tone, a soft tone. You've got things that have clouds or more of a overcast. Then you have direct sunlight, which is beaming down. Flash from a camera flash itself. There's so many different versions of how light reads. So by understanding how light weighs up on itself and how things can be rated via the Kelvin system, or color temperature, we can choose our white balance a little bit more effectively. So this could be as simple as, okay, I'm going to keep it on auto and let the camera do everything for me, but it could also be as complex as, okay, well, I'm going to be in this area, there's a lot of clouds in the sky next to me, it doesn't look like it's going to get sunny, let me switch over to a cloudy setting. Or maybe I'm going to switch to more of an incandescent setting. Or maybe I'm indoors, I'm in a place like Vegas where there's lights everywhere and I don't necessarily need it to be on auto. I don't necessarily need it to be on direct sunlight. Maybe I choose something like shade or fluorescent or incandescent to get a better look. The thing to keep in mind is that most all cameras will have presets that you can then change and bounce in between of. Sony, Nikon, Canon, they should all have those presets. On the flip side of that though, they also have it where you can really customize and pick these numbers yourself, and that's where the personalization comes in. I'll be honest, I mainly use the presets on there. I think that does more than the trick, but I like to manipulate those presets and choose which one based on the environment I'm shooting. Full manual is going to take everything I just mentioned in the last 5-10 minutes there, plus everything we've just been going over for about the last hour. That is the control over aperture, shutter, ISO, light metering, focus parameters, your ability to use autofocus, continuous, single, or manual focus. It's going to be your control over ISO. It's going to be your control over really everything on the camera that isn't a priority mode and isn't something you're automatically letting the camera control.
So if you're in full manual, does that mean you're not going to be in auto ISO?
You can still be an auto ISO. That one, that's the only one that continuously lets you stay the same.
Okay.
So full manual, you can just control shutter and aperture and just let ISO run normal. You can also let the white balance stay automatic. You can let the light metering stay balanced or stay automatic. You basically can just in full manual control the aperture and the shutter.
That is real cool.
Yeah. It's fun. Again, that's where then when I show that very beginning of snapshot versus photograph, that's what I mean by that is it's how much of this do you want to do to get that shot that could look just spectacular without you having to go on the computer and edit it, and how much of you just wants to say, okay, click. That's where then you get to have fun with it and you can master this a little bit more. The hard part is I can say it all till I'm blue in the face and I can show examples, but it always is always is going to come down to you just getting out and practicing. Realizing what the camera's doing, figuring it out, kind of playing with it, asking questions later on, but then also just evaluating your own work. I'm a big fan of critiquing my own work and presenting even my worst work in front of a body of peers, because I like to see what they have to say about it, and it helps me figure it out. That's one thing I miss about going to art school so much was the critique days where you'd sit there and you'd either get bashed in for your work or you'd get to really get some good feedback and positive things to pull from what you did, both positive and negative.
Yeah, that was amazing. The picture,
The
two
two?
pictures you showed in the beginning.
I like that. I think that's a nice way to kind of start off of like, this is what we're about to talk about to kind of prep, because it all seems like mumbo jumbo when you first like look at it. Camera language, shutters with the fractions. What is this? So if I can kind of give some images to explain it, I think it helps.
So when you're in manual, you use the f-stop and you open the lens all the way to 4, for example. That's letting a lot of light in.
That's letting a lot of light in. But that's then
250 is a good speed kind of thing.
yeah.
Okay.
Depends on what environment
you're
you're
doing.
in.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Thank you.
That's where you get to control.
That's awesome.
So let's look at some images and see what settings they use. This is basically something I've been doing since the first class for this one, where we're going to look at just a bunch of pictures, and I'm going to tell you what I think I see on there. If you think it's a little different, chime in and say something, but to kind of get it all started. We have this picture of a bridge, some landscape. This would probably be an ideal thing if you're on vacation and you just wanted to take pictures of the architecture. It's a dark sky, looks like it's overcast, there's really no clouds, or no moon or no sun, yet you've got some bright lights coming in there. So ISO is going to be a little higher. I probably would say 800, maybe a little higher than that. And I'd also say it's higher than that too, because if you can see the windows, how bright those lights are, I don't think anybody is having a, I mean, that's bright on those lights. So that would be my assumption, is that the ISO is jacked up a little higher. I would say as far as the aperture priority on this one, you're getting the background and the foreground all in pretty crisp detail. There's a slight blur on the building when you look from far behind. You can tell that the main focus is probably that part of the bridge there. So I probably would put this closer to, let's say, 8, maybe 11. From there, as far as shutter goes, there's not a lot of movement going on with this one, so I don't think that a high shutter would be needed. 1 250th of a second is what the highest I would go on this. Here you've got some cherry blossoms. Background is pretty blurred out on this image, so as far as aperture is concerned, I probably would say you're at something like a 2.8 to 4, maybe a 5.6, just because you can tell that those are cherry blossoms behind and more branches, but they're blurred out enough that you can't make out the finer details of it. The sun looks nice and bright based on the blue that we're seeing, so ISO at 100. And unless these things are moving violently in the wind, which I don't think they are, shutter is probably around that 250th, maybe 1/100th of a second, just based on how much light they get available. Two firemen, one in the back, one in the front, very similar to the dog photos that we looked at in the very beginning. The background has a heavy blur on it, but I would say not blurry enough that you can't tell that that's another fireman with a helmet, with a face, with a chin strap, and with the same type of microphone or walkie-talkie that he has on it there. So aperture-wise, probably around the same, 2.8, maybe 4. I don't think anything higher than that, so you can, again, tell what that is. As far as the lighting on this one, depending on the staging of this photo, if they're in movement, I would say ISO is probably anywhere between 200 up to 400, just based on how kind of warm these light tones are. Cooler would probably be on the lower side, warmer would be on the higher side, because then you can even tell from here, warmer tends to leave a little bit more for the imagination and keep things darker rather than colder. And that being said, shutter speed probably is going to be slow. I wouldn't imagine it's going to be that fast, just to get the detail on there, unless this was an action shot and they're walking and it's a sad photo, which it doesn't look like it is, even though his face looks really sad. I would probably say that shutter is around 1 250th of a second, maybe 1 400th of a second. Probably not that fast. I would probably lean towards slower. So we'll say 1 1/100th of a second to 1 250th of a second, all the way down to maybe 1 60th of a second. This one, the question I always pose to people: do we think it's stuffed or real?
You think it's what?
Stuffed or real?
Real.
Real. Yeah. I always wondered myself. I have no clue. I just wanted to ask. I always remember going to like the Field Museum and they've got those like areas with the animals that, and it's like, oh, those look real.
Yeah.
But I mean, just given the detail and the amount of color that we're getting from the horns, fur. I mean, when you get into some of these areas, you get purples and blues. It's a really cool color. The eyes also have that on there. It's a ram, so usually these things, if they see you and they don't like you, they're very upset and they will hit you. So that's one other reason, because it looks like we're real close on it. The background's got significant blurring on there, so the main subject is our ram. So we're probably going to put this at somewhere closer to that 2.84 range, a little higher than that. You can tell it's snow on the ground with branches. Shutter speed wise, that's why I asked if they think it's real or fake, because if it's real, you're probably doing this fast to get the hell away from it. I shouldn't say that on camera. To get away from it. If it's not moving, then it's going to be a slower speed. That's what then would, in my mind, make me feel like this detail that we're getting in the horns and the color pops more, because the slower we go, the more the camera's pulling in. So at 1 maybe 60th of a second, 1 1/30th of a second, I should say, that probably range as far as the shutter speed is concerned. ISO, given how dark and neutral everything is, I feel like it's very low. Looks like we've got light coming from kind of all directions. I see light coming from this direction. That's what's casting the shadow on the face, on the side there. Same thing on the top. We get some light that's coming here, but then when we get to the backs of the horns kind of looks like it gets darker until you get to like this side. There's more light. So I think light is pretty good, but the person who's taking the photo is choosing to making it darker. So we're probably looking at like 50 ISO. And that's where the moodiness comes in. This part too, because it's a blue, green, and purple. It's really kind of cool. Action photography. So again, dogs, you got movement, you got life. Right off the bat, light is strong on both of these. You've got shadows that are casting down, and we can see exactly where the shadow hits on the grass. So ISO 100 or lower. Background and foreground separation. The backgrounds are completely gone on both of these for the most part. You can tell that's trees and shrubs, and just based on the little shine marks I'm getting, there's probably like cars in the background there for a park or something. But I still would get close to like 1.4, 1.2, somewhere in that area, maybe a 2. Speed-wise is going to be the most important part of this. Freezing action. We've got heavy movement, and the ability that we do to get, this dog looks just terrifying, and then this guy looks like a little derpy derp, and I love it, it's just cute. So thinking about that movement and that kind of way of just capturing a very still moment with no motion blur, it's definitely 1 in 1500th of a second or higher. It's not going to be 1 in 1,000. It's going to be much higher than that. I even would maybe get close to 1 in 2,000th of a second, just imagining how fast those dogs are running to catch a frisbee.
So that would be 1,000 or higher, you said?
I would definitely, and I would probably get closer to 15 or 2,000. Because especially too, you've got so much light coming into the camera and on the images, so like if everything else is bright, so big aperture, to blur everything out in the background, a lot of sunlight, so you don't need a high ISO, that speed can be real turned up to really lock in whatever this is. Football, player diving into the end zone, plays for Navy, you can tell right off the bat. You can tell that 2 people are in the background, probably missed a tackle, something would have happened. 1 guy's on the floor, looks like a number 6 is walking from behind. So in that case, if we're looking at this, aperture is probably going to be something around the 8 to 11, because we can still make out the background, but there's slight blur on our guys. Light is good coming in. You can see that light's coming down this way. So ISO at the worst is probably 200 to 400 at the highest, I would say. If anything, it's probably about 100 range for the lowest. Shutter speed is going to be the big thing on this one though. So definitely at 1 in 1,000 speed. There's slight motion blur in certain areas, like when we see the little pebbles of the turf fly up. So that would be my assumption as far as like a shutter speed would be concerned. I'd say 1,000, maybe a little faster than that, 1,200, but not necessarily the 2,000 or anything crazy like we saw with the dogs.
And like the f-stop would be lower?
I mean, f-stop on this one, just given the background blur, I think would be actually a little higher, so probably will, when I say higher, I mean like a higher number versus a lower number, so probably like 11, maybe 16 on that one. Yeah, I'd say 11 to 8 to 11, because there's a decent amount of blur, but still enough that you can make out that the 2 players behind. One of the few last slides we have. Learning a camera is only the start. Anyone can learn to use a camera. You just gotta execute the stuff. You gotta go out, take the photos, keep trying with it. There's no way to fully comprehend everything I'm throwing at you and digest that without trying it out, practicing, and getting a better feel for it. My best camera accessories that are basically free. Practice, again, biggest thing. Take classes on one. One of my old students told me that she was taking classes over at what's the community college? No.
Triton CLC?
No, no, it's right down the street. Why can't I think of the name?
Oh yeah, on River Road?
I think it's on River Road. I'm from the city, I'm not going to the suburbs. But either way, it's not far from here. They were taking classes there, and they can take non-credited classes where it's just someone teaching for the heck of it. And I think that's a great thing to get into if you can just go and learn, and especially learn around people who are either younger students or just in general, they're hungry about it. You can then maybe fuel your desire with it too. I remember when I took photography classes, I was always the youngest one in there, and I had all these like older heads come up and they were just enthralled with either what I was using or what I was doing, and we would bounce ideas off, and it was really cool. So definitely put yourself in that environment more. YouTube is fantastic. I will die on that hill for the rest of my life. I think if you're not fully diving into the learning tool that YouTube is, you're using it wrong.
Is there one or two you recommend?
No, I really wish I had some. I just keep watching until I find somebody I like.
There's a lot out there.
There's so many. But I just kind of go, usually for me at this point now, I'm not necessarily looking at reviews on gear or how to use specific things.
Yeah.
I'm looking for tips and techniques that are cool and look fun. And
Yeah.
those are the videos I gravitate towards, where it's 2 minutes long, 3 minutes long. Guy shows a photo of a reference and it's like, here's how you get that image. And I'm like, that's what I want to know. So then I watch a bunch of their videos, follow, do all that stuff. Workshops are great too. I have 2 clubs that come and buy gear from me all the time. One is the club and workshop that goes out of the Chicago Botanic Gardens. They're wonderful people. They do competitions between themselves, and from what I understand, the Botanic Garden has it where whoever wins the competition, they get to be the picture on the newsletter. So there's like really cool perks with that. The other one is the O'Hare Flight Club, where there's a certain area on the tarmac. These guys can line up with their big lenses and they take pictures of the planes as they land and fly up. They'll come in and buy the big bad lenses from us, and it's really fun. And then travel. If you're going out of town, if it's work, if it's for fun, if it's a convention, bring the camera with you, take it. It can't hurt. Worst case scenario, you don't have enough time to take pictures. Best case scenario, after you're done with whatever it is that you got to do that's either work or something else related, then take the camera out, take pictures. I think that's the best part. If you're,
And how about your classes? How long have you been doing this?
I do it every month. The schedule just keeps repeating itself.
So every Thursday?
Every Thursday
So
we
you
run
just
this. Yep.
Come back again and just
Yeah.
review?
Yeah. So if you forget, let's say a year from now, you're like, I haven't touched this thing in forever. I get a lot of people that do that, where it's like I'll see them, and I don't see them for 6 months, then I see them again, and I'm like, oh, you're back. So if you can, come back in. Other accessories you got to spend a little bit of money on. I tell people that if there is any 4 that I would really recommend, it's the top 4. Get the bag, protect the gear that you purchase, or a case. Those are fantastic, even more protection. Extra battery and an extra memory card. I think that's a no-brainer on there. If there's $90 to $100, I think you should put into something. Get yourself an extra battery, extra memory card. My camera, I use it all the time. I had an event yesterday and I was like gonna bring it with for this meeting I had to go to. As soon as I turned the camera on, my battery, which was fully charged a week ago, was already half full. So I'm like, okay, I need to put this thing back on the charger and get it going. Luckily I had another battery that I could bring with me, so I didn't have to worry too much. Memory cards, they're flimsy, have another one. Lens cleaning kit. Don't use your t-shirt, your anything. If you're 4 eyes, you know that you have a lens cleaning cloth for your glasses. Use the same thing for your lens. In the long run of things, it's mirror your lens, date your body. The lens doesn't really depreciate, the camera body does. So try to take good care of that. Straps, fantastic. I have one of the Peak Design straps on my camera, and it's great because it's a quick release. So right now, don't need it on. I can take it off, but then if I do want it on, I can just lock it into place and do it. It also has extra padding in the back too, which is really nice if you've got a sensitive neck. Other than that, tripods are great if you're interested in stability with your photos. External hard drives are a great way to save images if you don't want to do cloud-based solutions. Filters, polarizing, ND, those are both great if you can kind of learn and grasp more about what that means. Watch some videos online with those. I was going to actually mention that to you. There's really cool ones out there where people will break down what they do, show them in the exact same type of lighting. That's another thing you can do when you get a new filter and kind of just get used to it. Is just set it up somewhere, take the same image, keep adjusting, take it on, put it back on or off, and just kind of get a feel for what is it doing to my pictures.
Yeah.
Additional lenses are great too. If you are getting the kit lens or you've got a hand-me-down lens or some other stuff, try out different lenses. Go to we're a great example. If you bring your camera body, and I always recommend it, we'll throw other lenses on there. Even if you're not going to buy something, just get a feel for what another lens looks like and maybe put the idea in your head. As you're playing with the lenses you have, you might realize the limitations you have and the things that you're trying to achieve, and that should help you pinpoint in on maybe what else I'm looking for or what else you want.
Question on the external hard drive, what do
Yeah.
you mean by that?
Remember last week we talked about using cloud-based solutions
Oh, yeah.
or an external hard drive to save your photos? That's a great way to just have your photos backed up to another source that's not just the computer.
Okay.
And
Does, oh, go ahead, go ahead.
The external hard drive, you're also including SSD.
SSD works too. Yeah, exactly. SSD is going to be faster. I have been using external hard drives for as long as I can remember. I lock in on the external hard drives. But yes, SSD is just a bigger, badder version of the standard little SD card. Just it's kind of like on steroids, if you will.
Does it download faster when you do the SD card version? Because like I tried to download like 700 photos the other day.
And you do straight from the camera.
Yeah,
Took forever.
yeah, like I did. I found the cord
Yeah.
to do it, but it was horrible.
It could be one of two things. It could be the speed of that it was slow. Typically removing the card also helps with the speed. It could also be the physical SD card that you have. If it's a slower card, which first, I mean, that's not a bad thing. It just, that means it'll take a little bit longer to read and write. That's why the very first thing we talked about in the last class was the speed of the card.
Yeah.
It might not be important for when you're first starting, but the more advanced you get, the more time you build up photos on there. Like my cards, I know so I go to Australia in 3 weeks, 4 weeks. I'll be there for 2.5 weeks. During that 2.5 week time span, I will probably have accumulated about 5,000 plus photos just in my little time. If I don't have a card that can output that stuff, I'm looking at like 2 days to download all that stuff. It's awful.
And how do you find the speed on the card again?
Some of them will tell you, you have an
Is it
XQD, so yours is real fast, but right there, 440 and 400, that's the read and
What
write.
is this?
That's 80 megabytes a second. So that's a
So
slower card,
that's
this is a faster one. This is faster for your higher quality images. You also have a fast card too, so that
I
probably.
can't switch it, this one goes on top of it.
Yeah, there's just a specific ports for those.
Okay, but this is the fast one.
That's the fast one. You both have faster cards. What I would say on your end is most likely because you use the cable inside the camera. And I usually don't. I don't recommend using it for multiple reasons, but
Cool.
other than that, do I have anything else? No. Next week is advanced cameras. We're going to talk about just kind of the ins and outs of taking a clean and pretty photo and just the tips and tricks. I always tell people rules are meant to be broken with that one. So what I tell you is one thing, what you choose to do is just maybe keep it in mind and then play with it. We'll talk about editing your photos, and then I believe the last big thing we talk about is advanced accessories that come into more content creation. If you're doing videography or filming and you really want to have some additional equipment to help you get that done, that's some of the stuff we'll talk about next week. That's all I got for you guys. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Of course. Anybody has any questions, stick around, ask me some, and then, yeah.
If I like play around with all my settings so much and then like I am like freaked out that I changed so many things, does it reset?
Depending on which one you're on. So
Okay.
with your camera, you have.
Because for some reason earlier I somehow got into miniature something.
Ah.
Miniature effect.
Yes, that's an effect that they have on there. You can turn that off. So if you ever get back into that,
Yeah, I think it's gone. I think I was on. I was either on FB.
okay. Either one of them, if you press the Q set button in the center, as it gets past it again, there should be an effects area. So that A, with like the crazy little like lines next to it, that's your picture style. And you can do all sorts of different like fun ones on there. You should see miniature on there somewhere. If it's not there, then it's around that area.
Okay.
But basically, they do like color profiles. Like that's one of the reasons I like Nikon so much, is because I can like set mine sometimes on there, and it's really
Yeah.
fun.
I did actually find they do have a setting for cars, dolls, or animals.
Nice. So they have the eye tracking center on there.
Yeah, I think so.
That might help with it, and then just the focus parameters. Instead of doing like a dot, try to do like a wider perspective, and that should help with keeping the whole face, and
Okay.
blurring the background out.
Okay.
You were gonna show me
Which one?
the focusing, area?
So on that, if you just go to the main area, press the I button, you should be able to then, let's put the we're in full manual.
Yeah, let's see.
Is it dead? I saw the picture of it, this thing.
That is gonna be for your light metering. So that's how you dictate your light metering on this one. On this guy, it is going to be.
Thank you.
Yeah, anytime. Have a good one.
You too.
I thought it was that.
No, that's your light metering.
Okay.
So that's not that one. There's your autofocus. Change that.
I mean, I wanna leave it at full view anyway, but I don't know, to change it out once in a while.
That's the movement. Got your white balance adjustment. I'm trying to think. I know the switch is here. Questions, Let me do a little research and
Okay.
figure it out for you.
I'll be back
It's
next week.
one of the buttons, and I know it's somewhere around here. That's your control of that. Basically, and I can see it right there. It's where it says norm, and then it has the like circle with like the squares there. There's a way to change that, so that way you get a certain perspective.
But right now it's the whole view, right?
Right now, yeah.
Okay, we'll leave it like that.
Yeah, I didn't play with that, figure that out. It's
Okay.
been a minute since I held one of these guys.
Yeah, this,
There's a lot of settings on there.
thank you.
I was wanting to look at that Peak Design 6-liter bag,
Yeah.
because with this lens, it's a
Yeah.
tight fit.
Yeah.
If you don't have time tonight, I can come back.
I do have to get going a little bit, but I can go down there for a second to show. You can do it real quick.
I can.
Are you sure?
Yeah.
Whatever's easier for you. I don't want to make it
Well,
another trip
maybe
in.
Monday we can bring Henry. Henry loved playing with that board there.
Monday, absolutely. Then we can
Yeah.
talk if there's any other settings or anything else you need to go over.
Okay, thanks, Axon.
Anytime. Good to having you. Thanks for coming in.
Yeah, thanks for joining us.
Oh,
Thank you.
absolutely.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, of course, guys.
See you next week.
See you next week.
Okay.
Everybody, thanks for coming on for the online. If anybody has any questions, comments, or concerns, my email, phone number are there. I will be on next week for intermediate or advanced. And then I won't be here for the final Thursday. I have someone subbing in for me. He'll be doing the Beyond the Traditional camera. So, yeah, everybody have a great night. Be safe. And as always,